Welcome to another episode of the Dan Norton Show. Today, I am here with Liam. Liam reached out to me through Discord recently, and there were a couple topics he wanted to talk about, and I was happy to do that. So here we are. So, Liam, how about you? Well, first of all, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Yeah.
And can you just briefly introduce yourself to my audience?
Yeah. My name's Liam. I just graduated high school. I'm gonna major in finance. I've been an objectivist for quite a while. I've been studying objectivism. And I have a TikTok where I talk about objectivism and kind of debate these ideas. And I have a YouTube channel where some of my debates are also there. But yeah, I'm just super passionate about objectivism.
Okay, so you just graduated high school and you said you're an objectivist or you've been one for a while. That's pretty young. I didn't learn about Ayn Rand until right after high school, actually. So did you come across it through school, like through the English class? Did you read one of her books, or how did you come across Rand?
So I was in debate in high school, and kind of a natural progression of that is, looking into economics, and I saw some capital, like, objectivist stuff, capitalism, good stuff, and I've always kind of wanted to build the best fortified argument, and so it kind of just led me deeper and deeper into philosophy, and then I, just kind of fell in love with it.
Okay, so through debate initially. All right. And you had mentioned that there were some things you wanted to talk about in particular. How about letting us know so we can have a little agenda? We don't have to stick to it too strictly, but at least to get something out on the table.
Okay, so there are two main points that of objectivism that I think are really interesting and kind of underdeveloped in terms of how well they're kind of captured in objectivist movement. The first one is kind of metaethics and its relationship to pleasure. So there's this whole debate around happiness being an ultimate value, the purpose of pleasure in life, whether or not there's other reasons for the pre-moral choice, stuff like that. That whole area. And then the second one is free will. Um, the whole irreducible choice to focus, how that relates to you know uh, like determinism and the proof for it. So, but those two big general ideas are kind of what I'm interested in.
Okay. I think those are two very interesting and tr very tricky areas, which have come up quite a bit in my debates and discussions. And in some of them, you might see me fumbling around a bit trying to give an answer because I wouldn't say I'm 100% clear myself or have complete command of those areas of objectivism. I would like to understand them better. But yeah, happy to talk about both of those things and maybe we can learn something, discover something together, whatever. Um, so good. How about you kick it off? You can say more specifically what question you have or how whatever angle you want to come at this from.
Okay. Yeah. So I saw in a video, I think it's a video you have titled like, what I disagree with Rand about, or, what I disagree with objectivism about. And in it, you kind of talk about like a very strict definition of hedonism and whether or not you'd classify yourself as a hedonist. I was kind of wondering if you use the hedonist label in that strict way still, if you believe that morality is about, pursuing emotions all your life as a standard, maybe, but ultimately it's about pursuing positive feelings.
Okay. So just to set this up a little more for anyone who's not familiar with that video, I had a chat, I don't know how long ago this was, maybe a year or two, with Dave Goodman. And in that chat, he asked me if I had any disagreements with the objectivist philosophy. And I mentioned two things, not that they weren't like definite disagreements, but just questions I had. I wasn't sure I disagreed. So one, which I won't go into now because it's not what Liam mentioned, is the it pertains to the dictionary definition of selfishness. Rand makes a claim about that in the introduction to the virtue of selfishness. She says there's a certain dictionary definition of that term, which if you look in dictionaries is usually not in there. So I'm not sure that is the correct claim that she makes about what the dictionary definition of selfishness is. But we'll set that aside for the moment. The other issue I raised questions about was whether Rand's view could be considered a type of hedonism. Now, she explicitly rejects hedonism in her article, The Objectivist Ethics, in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. But if you understand hedonism in a certain way, I was wondering if it might be consistent with her view, because she says things like happiness is the ultimate value, or well, she says different things. Sometimes she says life is the ultimate value. Um, Sometimes she says happiness is the highest moral purpose.
Right.
Now, what exactly is the relation of those claims? If something is your highest purpose, could you construe that as your highest value? Is it just when she says happiness is the highest purpose, is that just like a psychological angle on some larger thing that we're pursuing, namely life? So I think it's a little tricky to get clear on exactly what is the relationship between those two, life and happiness. And she does discuss that in the objectivist ethics, but I can't say I'm 100% clear on that issue. But anyways, I was thinking the hedonists, now I'm no expert on hedonism, but for my, uh, I have some familiarity with them. Their view is that pleasure is the ultimate value. Now, if you can construe pleasure in a very narrow sense to mean, for example, like physical pleasure that you would get from like eating ice cream, that's clearly not Rand's view, that physical pleasure is the highest end and that's all that matters. It does matter, but it doesn't exhaust what matters. There's also psychological pleasure, but that's where something like happiness might come into the picture. So if you construe pleasure in a broad sense and construe hedonism in a broad sense, so when they say pleasure is the ultimate value, if that includes something like happiness, well, then one might wonder, is that consistent with Rand's views, since she says happiness is the highest moral purpose?
Mm.
It's not obvious to me, at least, that that's, extremely far afield from what hedonists are saying. Um, so that's not to say that you should whim worship, um, but you still have to use reason. But what is the reason for? What's the value you're ultimately aiming at? Is it happiness? Is it pleasure construed in this broad sense? If you do construe it in this broad sense, I was thinking maybe hedonism is consistent with Rand's view. So that's what I was questioning in that video about whether I had any disagreements. I thought maybe if I sat down with Rand and I talked it over with her for a while and explained exactly the sense of hedonism I had in mind, maybe she would say, okay, well, I can sign
Mhm.
on to that. Or maybe not. I'm not sure, but that's something I have a question about.
Yeah, so on that kind of question about hedonism, and I think the most insightful passage on Rand's thoughts about hedonism and happiness, and maybe there is a sense of hedonism that she falls under. In VOS, she has this passage about the maintenance of life is like a different aspect on, pursuing happiness, like the same thing. It's just from a different perspective. But after that, she has this whole thing about how happiness is like what makes life worth living, or like gives someone the feeling of, this is what living is for in a way. But then after that, she doesn't refute that by necessarily saying that happiness isn't what life is for, right? She then kind of just attacks the idea that happiness is undefined and like kind of it's like causally chaotic. It has real rational reasons for why it exists. It has a mechanism behind it. Like if your life is succeeding, then you're happy. Um, so I mean, at least from my understanding of hedonism, if you understand it in that broad way, where you know, uh, if the purpose of living is this kind of broad conceptual joys and stuff like that, then it seems like she would be some type of hedonist. But she would never use that word because I mean, the way she defines hedonism is really the focus on like happiness and pleasure. They're not. They have causes. They have rational reasons for being the way they are.
Uh, so there's a lot there. Just first thing I'll mention is you used VOS. For anyone who doesn't know, that's the
Oh,
virtue of
sorry.
selfishness. Um, I think this is the first edition. It's kind
Yeah.
of so in the virtue of selfishness. The first essay is the Objectivist Ethics, and in there's a passage where Rand is talking about the relation of happiness in life, and that's what Liam was just referring to. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the copy that I have all marked up, which would help me find quicker that passage, but I think I just found it in this copy. Maybe I can just read a little of that to help orient people. Um, let's see. Here's the if it takes me a long time to find it, I'll just edit this out um, later. I'm close. Okay, here's where she talks about hedonism. So, just going back to the one thing I mentioned before, so she says at times life is the purpose of life, and also happiness is the purpose of life. And I don't know where all those, I can't give you exact
Right.
paragraph citations, but I do remember she says both of those things. But here, I'll just read a little of the passage you were referring to. The maintenance of life and the pursuit of happiness are not two separate issues. To hold one's own life as one's ultimate value and one's own happiness as one's highest purpose are two aspects of the same achievement. Existentially, the activity of pursuing rational goals is the activity of maintaining one's life. Psychologically, its result, reward, and concomitant is an emotional state of happiness. It is by it is by experiencing happiness that one lives one's life in any hour, year, or the whole of it. And when one experiences the kind of pure happiness that is an end in itself, the kind that makes one think, this is worth living for, what one is greeting and affirming in emotional terms is the metaphysical fact that life is an end in itself. Okay. So she's well known, at least in the objectivist world, for uh, providing a life-based ethics, and this is part of her what she thinks makes life or ethics objective. The concept of value or of good uh, is genetically or hierarchically dependent on this concept of life.
Hmm.
So life is what gives rise to the phenomenon of values.
Hmm.
But then there's this question of, how does happiness fit in? And another question that just came to my mind is, what about plants?
Right.
Plants, they don't have consciousness, so they don't have anything like happiness. Um, Now, is there anything the plants have values in a strict sense,
Right.
or just any kind of metaphorical sense? Like, is there any reason a plant should want to stay alive? Well, it's
Hmm.
not obvious. I mean, how can it have something like wants? Wants are a phenomenon of consciousness. Um, I raised the question like this at the recent Objectivist conference in Anaheim just a couple months ago
Yeah.
in the Q&A of a talk by Tara Smith. I guess it hasn't
Okay.
come out yet. I think eventually it'll probably come out on YouTube. But anyways, um, I'm not sure that plants have values in a strict sense. Uh, but so how does happiness fit in here? Where things are going after life, but they're also going after happiness, at least if they're conscious.
Yeah.
So I've rambled for a while, and I just wanted to give some concrete evidence from the text to ground this discussion a little bit. But then there's this question of hedonism. Let me read a little more here to where she talks about hedonism. So after that paragraph that I just read, she goes on, but the relationship of cause to effect cannot be reversed. It is only by accepting man's life as one's primary and by pursuing the rational values it requires that one can achieve happiness, not by taking happiness as some undefined, irreducible primary
Mhm.
and then attempting to live by its guidance. So I think right there, that's where she's starting to differentiate herself from the hedonists. These are people who do take happiness as this undefined, irreducible primary, and then attempt to live by its guidance. I'll do whatever makes me happy. That's the way to live. Um, Rather, she's saying we need to think, well, what does life require? And then happiness is kind of a byproduct of that. If you don't have this perspective of aiming at life, if you're only aiming at happiness, then it's unclear what to do. But if you aim at life, I guess that's a little more concrete or objective or something, and that can provide you some more concrete guidance. It's less subjective.
Right.
And I think that's what's going on here. That's how she's trying to distinguish herself from the hedonists. And
Right.
then she goes on, if you achieve that which is good by a rational standard of value, it will necessarily make you happy.
Right.
But that which makes you happy by some undefined emotional standard is not necessarily the good. To
Right.
take, quote, whatever makes one happy as a guide to action means to be guided by nothing but one's emotional whims. Emotions are not tools of cognition. To be guided by whims, by desires whose source, nature, and meaning one does not know, is to turn oneself into a blind robot operated by unknowable demons, by one's stale evasions, a robot knocking its stagnant brains out against the walls of reality which it refuses to see. This is the fallacy inherent in hedonism, in any variant of ethical hedonism, personal or social, individual or collective. Happiness can properly be the purpose of ethics, but not the standard. Maybe that's good place to stop. Well, actually, let me just read a few more sentences, then I'll stop. Um, the task of ethics is to define man's proper code of values and thus give him the means of achieving happiness. To declare, as the ethical hedonists do, that, quote, the proper value is whatever gives you pleasure, unquote, is to declare that, quote, the proper value is whatever you happen to value, unquote,
Hmm.
which is an act of intellectual and philosophical abdication, an
Hmm.
act which merely proclaims the futility of ethics and invites all men to play at deuces wild.
Hmm.
So that's her critique of hedonism, and it gives us an idea of how she's understanding hedonism. And I think if you understand it in this way, um, as a kind of as a form of whim worship, where you're just aiming at happiness and you have nothing else to guide you, I can see how that would be problematic.
Yeah.
But if you have a different construal of hedonism as it's just the ultimate aim, but it's not necessarily the only thing you think about, you think, well, what do I have to do to achieve happiness? Um, then maybe you can bring in something about life there to ground it and make it not subjective.
Hmm.
Um, I just had a thought that flitted through my mind, like, can you take happiness? Can you define happiness apart from life?
Hmm.
Um, I'm not sure if you can. There's a plane going by. I don't know if you can hear that right now. It's kind of
No, I can't.
distracting me. I think my mic filters out that noise. Um, so she defines happiness in one play, or I don't know if it's a definition, but she characterizes it as the state that proceeds from the achievement of one's values,
Hmm.
something like that. I'm not sure if that's exactly it. But then can you, so that definition includes the term values. So it presupposes some understanding of what a value is, but can you
Hmm.
understand what a value is apart from life?
Right.
If not, then I guess you do have to bring in life. You can't just say I'm going to aim at happiness and have no conception of how that ties to life. If life is via the concept values contained in the notion of happiness. Okay, I've gone on for a while, but I want to stop and give you a chance to talk.
No, yeah, so it's kind of interesting that you raised that question to Tara Smith. Um so I've read Tara Smith's book Viable Values. It's, a metaethics book. It kind of goes over the different conceptions of values and what their nature is. And her big conclusion that I think is relevant to this discussion is she constructs this idea of the pre-moral choice, right? So like the question is like, are there reasons to live, right? Um, well, it seems like if you take life as the ultimate value and you don't like understand that emotionally or by maybe implying the happiness as part of the ultimate value. If you just understand it strictly, then it would conclude there is no reason to live, right? It's only if you're living that there are reasons to, or if you're, I guess, committed to living. But it seems to be that seems to be contradictory to what I've seen other objectivists say. So this is like a really niche reference, but Peikoff has a lecture titled "The Proper Role of Emotions." And hold on, and in that lecture, um, Peikoff says that there is no reason to live if there is no pleasure or joy or positive emotion. He's like, well, what's the point? And he says that there is no justification you need to pursue pleasure and like, this kind of broader conceptual pleasure, not just, physical sensation. He says that, these kinds of conceptual, more important positive emotions, there's no need to justify those. They're justified in and of themselves. And so my kind of approach to this and my solution is kind of in this. Um, I think that whenever I use evaluative language, when I ask why should I do something, do I have a reason to do something, things like that. I think that those concepts reduce down to positive emotional experiences. So whenever I ask for a reason to do something, I'm really asking for a motive here. I'm asking for a kind of motivating psychological state. And so if somebody asks me, well, are there reasons to live? Well, the reasons to live are the positive emotional states. Um, that's kind of my thing. My view, I think it's what Ayn Rand is trying to say, that the purpose of life is a life of enjoyment, a life of, pleasureful, positive emotional experiences. It seems like that's the reason you live. That's what makes it worthwhile. And so in that sense, obviously plants don't have values, right? Because I mean, plants don't have conscious apparatus. And that might be what distinguishes the plant vegetative sense of value from like a moral value, maybe because there's not a conscious motivation or something like that.
Okay. So there were a few things I wrote down here. Um, First, I'll just throw out a name for anyone who might want to explore this topic further. There's a guy by the name of, I don't know how you pronounce it. He's Norwegian. Ole, Martin Moen. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah, I've read that paper, yeah.
Okay.
The one on
Well,
life is or happiness is the value. Yeah.
so he argues for some kind of hedonism, and he wrote a dissertation. I think it's called what it's got an interesting title, but I can't remember what it is.
It's like a reassessment of life as the ultimate value,
Oh,
I think.
it's called the title of his dissertation is "Because It Feels Good."
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
quite a title for a PhD dissertation. And he argues for a kind of hedonism, and he thinks it's maybe it can be made consistent with Rand's view, maybe for the sorts of reasons that I was exploring earlier in this chat. But so for people interested in this topic, you might want to check out his work. He has a paper in Reason Papers on this topic, which David Kelly replied to. And I think I've gone back and forth on whether I think Kelly makes a good reply to him.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, some other things that you brought up. So just for you mentioned a pre-moral choice for anyone who's not familiar. I thought maybe I should say a little bit more about that. So on Ayn Rand's view, there's a fundamental choice at the basis of ethics, which is whether to live or not. And that choice gives rise to the whole normative field. So there are no oughts or shoulds until you've made this choice to live. So for example, it doesn't make any sense to say you ought to eat a certain diet if you haven't yet chosen to live, because the only reason you should eat a certain diet is because it helps you live. Or, given our discussion today, you might say the reason is because it makes you happy or gives you some kind of pleasure in a physical sense of pleasure, or maybe also a broader sense of pleasure. But there's some choice at the basis of any prescription that you ought to do something. And that's what Liam was alluding to when he was talking about a pre-moral choice. So it's not until we've made this pre-moral choice that the whole field of morality, of what you ought to do, is in existence. Um, so what is that pre-moral choice? Is it the choice to live? Uh, If so, how should we construe that? Should we construe living as including happiness?
Hmm.
Because if it doesn't include anything like happiness or something, some psychological aspect, then it's not clear why you should choose anything. What difference does it make? And you were talking about how Peikoff says something like, well, if something doesn't give you any kind of pleasure or joy or satisfaction at all, there's no reason to do that. Um, okay. And then you said, so you were saying that the way you think of it now, ultimately, there's got to be some kind of psychological, uh, some positively valenced
Right.
psychological phenomenon to justify doing anything. Otherwise, it's not clear why you should do it. There really is no justification.
Yeah.
And that seems plausible to me. And then if that's the case, then it's not clear that plants have values, or if they do, not in the same, it's not clear they have values in the same sense that we have values. So if the only reason for us as human beings to do anything is because we get some kind of psychological benefit from it,
Mhm.
and plants don't have psychology at all, then there's no reason for plants to do anything rather than anything else. Like, why turn the leaves towards the sun, or why stretch their roots out to get water? There's no reason for it to do that, since they're not getting any psychological benefit, since they don't have psychologies.
Mhm.
Now, there is another definition of value, or maybe I shouldn't say another. There is a definition, or a characterization. I've heard Harry Benswanger, I think he said it's not really a definition, but it's just something to get a conversation about values going. When Rand says a value is that which one acts to gain and or keep, you might say, well, plants do that. They do act to gain and or keep things, like they
Mhm.
act to gain water or sunlight. And so, um, if they're doing that, then they have values in that sense. But is that a value worth wanting, or the sort of value that could be that humans could have? Well,
Mhm.
it seems like we're saying now, well, maybe you need something more. You need something psychological to make sense of it. Okay. Um, Now I don't know if some of that was just I just wanted to get more on the table for our audience. Um, Let me put one more. Let's see. Should I mention the experience machine? Have you heard of that experiment, the thought
Is that
experiment?
is that like what if I put someone in a machine where they'd get like a bunch of positive experiences? Should they do that? Is that the idea?
Well, it could be any experience at all, but you could program it um, so that you have only positive experiences. This comes from the philosopher Robert Nozick.
Oh, okay.
He was um, he was a Harvard philosopher, and he had this thought experiment. What if you could choose to step into this machine? Like, you can think of it like a phone booth, but people who are younger might not even know what that is. Like a little closet. And it's kind of like the Matrix. Maybe that's a more modern reference that more people can relate to. You can hook yourself up to this machine, and then you have this like simulation. You can imagine your Beethoven, or that level of quality of a composer. You could write these world famous symphonies, and or you write classic novels like Atlas Shrugged. You could do these amazing things, and you could have all the pleasure that comes with that. Whatever experiences you want, you could just program into this machine. You plug yourself into it, Now, you're not really writing these amazing novels or symphonies or going on these amazing vacations to Mars or wherever. You just have the illusion. But would you would you plug into this machine for life if you could?
Oh yeah.
And uh, uh, and you, I think a lot of people, when they are presented with this question, their answer is no. Why? Well, there's something about the authenticity of the experience that they value.
Right.
If it's not really happening, then it's there's something unsatisfying about that. And so even if you could have these amazing experiences, most people, I think this is just what surveys have shown. I don't know if there's like scientific surveys of this, but I think that generally, when people are presented with this, they say, no, I would not want to plug into this thing for life. Um, Maybe I'll try it out for a while, but I wouldn't want to give up my actual life and just be plugged in this into this machine. But I actually have a different. So I don't fall into that common response. I don't see a reason not to plug into the machine. Like if we stipulate that you're going to feel better by going into this machine, and we can even imagine like I'm leaving all my real friends or my significant other behind if I'm married, let's say. Now I just have a fake wife or fake children, fake friends in this simulation, but I don't know they're fake. I think they're real.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Yeah.
but imagine I can go in and have this fake life and I still have all my family and friends and values and it feels great. Like we can even stipulate it's better. It feels
Right.
even
Right.
better than the actual world. I don't see a reason not to do it. Now, I would be scared that this machine wouldn't actually work, but that's kind of we can just set that aside. We can
Right.
just stipulate as part of the thought experiment that this thing is going to work. It's fail safe. I don't see a good reason not to go into the experience machine forever if you're going to feel better than you would if you didn't. So, and there's also something about like the authenticity issue, which I don't really buy. Like feelings are, um, in a way, they can't be inauthentic. Like if you have pain, what it is to have the pain is just to have the experience.
Right.
There's
Right.
nothing more than that. So, it's not like inauthentic pleasure if you're experiencing it in the machine. Um, so I don't see a reason not to go in the machine and just have
Mm.
this weird kind of life. And maybe that shows or is a way of showing that something psychological is really ultimately what matters. Well, at least
Right.
for me,
Yeah.
if not for all other human beings. Now, I don't know if I addressed like some things so the last time you spoke you raised in my mind a lot of thoughts which I've just put on the table, but I don't know if that advanced the discussion for you at all, but I at least wanted to get a lot more on the table for people to consider. But let me throw it back to you.
Yeah, so on the kind of I guess experience machine, I think that a lot of the feelings I have that are negative about that have to do with things that are stipulated around in the hypothetical. So, like losing my values that I have here or something. Some people might have the feeling like they're faking reality or something like that. But I mean, if you can stipulate into the example that you actually won't have those kinds of consequences like weighing on your conscience, like you wouldn't have the stipulation that you might just not remember any of them. Um, you get rid of the mortality issue, like could I die in here and something like that. Like if it really is like you go in there and your life is just better, then yeah, I agree with you. I don't see why you shouldn't do that. And another thing too is like, well, let's think about it in reverse. Like, what if I like put somebody in there since birth, right? And it's a couple years, it's like they're in their adult life, and I take them out. Like, would it be wrong for them to go back in? Right? It's like their life is better in there, right? They weren't, I guess, in the real world, quote unquote. But I agree with what you said. Like, what does that mean, real world? Like, real, like they're experiencing it. They're having an experience of the pleasure. The pleasure is very much existing. Now, I mean, if by real they mean, yeah, I mean, like real there just kind of seems it's vague to me what they mean by real. Um, but yeah, I would agree. I would stay in the machine if if it really was better for me. I think that people, I think the another thing too is the thought experiment is like kind of implicitly cutting away at the way that we understand pleasure and pain. And so we might have a disdain from it for that reason. Like we have this understanding that there are certain, real causal things that cause pleasure and pain, like achieving your goals and such and such and such. And in some way, this thought experiment is like a cheat. Like you just kind of cheat and you get around the way that reality normally works to feel pleasure and pain. And you get it now from this thing. You might have a hesitation then because it feels as if you're cheating reality, but I think again, if you could erase your memory of all of that, right? They're just kind of implying that they might be psychologically implying that they're not really accepting the thought experiment as it really being all positive. They might be like accidentally carrying in when they think about it, the feelings they might have because of the experiment is strange. But yeah, I mean, I would agree. I would agree with that. You should go in the box on on what Benswinger says. I think Benswinger, and I don't remember the lecture, or I don't even know if it was a lecture. I think I just saw some video. And there's this thought experiment in objectivism about the, immortal robot. It's like if there's a robot, its life is, it's immortal. Would it have values? Like what would it act to gain and or keep? And I would agree, right, that there is nothing to act to gain and or keep. Its life isn't conditional. But someone asked this question to Benswinger, what if the robot had emotions, right? And Benswinger says, well, that's not the experiment. In this experiment, it would actually have things to pursue because there's this conditional of happiness or joy or suffering, right? And so I really do think it's consistent with the objectivist ethics to understand pleasure and positive emotional experiences as being super, super important to the ethics and as being the purpose. I think that Rand's her motive, and I mean, this is kind of speculative, but I think that her kind of like treatment of hedonism to talk about it so negatively and to kind of avoid putting such a high priority on emotions, I think that's because she wants to avoid being called a subjectivist and a hedonist. I think that's just kind of it's like a rhetorical tactic. I think Rand would agree that pleasure is like inherently motivating. You should go for it. Another thing too in the objectivist ethics to kind of push back on happiness specifically being our highest value or our highest purpose is there are other types of pleasure, right? So whenever we say happiness is our ultimate purpose or our highest purpose, does that mean that all of our actions are to serve that purpose? Because I don't think I would agree. So, there's this whole emphasis on like the importance of sex in objectivism and how sex is it's like an expression of self-esteem. It's a good celebration. It's very pleasurable. But like it doesn't seem to say that like we pursue sex to be happy or we pursue sex to live. It seems like the pleasure just contained in sex itself is a warrant for pursuing it. You don't pursue it for the, durable long-range happiness. It might contribute to that, right? That might be something it causes too, but it's pursuable for its own sake. And so that's why when I understand objectivism and I understand the pleasure or the value and role of emotions, I understand life as the ultimate value being a life of enjoyment, not specifically happiness as the highest value, not specifically pleasure, but like positive emotional experiences as being the ultimate value. You might say that happiness is the most important among those in the sense that a long, durable kind of span of feeling good and this kind of constant, steady emotion, that's like, really like that might be the most important kind of positive emotion. But I don't think that these other positive emotions serve happiness like eating serves living. I think it'd be good in it for its own sake.
Okay. So you're understanding happiness as a kind of deep, enduring leitmotif. I think that word is used somewhere in the objectivist literature that undergirds your life as a whole. So you might have ups and downs on a daily basis
Right.
or an hourly basis, but more fundamentally, you have a positive feeling about the world and yourself.
Hmm.
So, if anyone has read the novel The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, there's this line by Howard Roark someone asks him, do you ever feel pain or something like this? He says, yes, but it only goes down to a certain point. So yes, there are, positive and negative things that he feels, but fundamentally, in a very deep way, he feels positively. And to have that fundamental, deep, positive feeling is what in the objectivist literature is called happiness. Now, other people, this term is, it's thrown around a lot, and people have different
Yeah.
understandings of what happiness is, but that's the sense that you were just describing. So, just for anyone who wasn't familiar, so you were saying that so that's one type of positive psychological experience, but there are other types,
Mm.
and you think that's well, what were you saying about that? Just that they're all worth aiming at, or this maybe one some are more important than others, or what was your point about that?
Yeah, my point is that the ultimate value is not simply happiness. The ultimate value is a life of enjoyment. And so by enjoyment,
Okay.
I mean well, like the wide range of conceptual pleasures you can have over, of course, the course of, your life, like long term.
Okay. So a life these full of enjoyment, and I guess we can use enjoyment as a broad term to encompass
Yeah,
happiness plus the more narrow kinds of positive
like love
affects.
and self-esteem and beauty. That's another thing too, is all those kinds of things. All the positive emotions we normally consider day to day and as the like human experience, the
Hmm.
these human distinctive kind of emotions. That's what I mean when I say enjoyment.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that seems reasonable to me. I guess when you're formulating an ethics, you might want to simplify it in a way and give one thing that is the highest thing to aim at. And maybe that's why Rand picks happiness out, even if she acknowledges there are other kinds of positive psychological experiences to be had,
Right.
um, like the pleasure of getting a joke or something.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
uh, I'm sure she would have nothing against that, have a laugh at something. Um, Not laughing at, a value, but laughing at something that's um, like humor can be used in a cutting way, like you're cutting,
Sure.
like you shouldn't laugh at the good,
Yeah.
laugh at something evil or bad. But anyways, there are positive uses of humor, and she in formulating an ethics, she might not want to mention those as the highest value. Um, and just to keep it simple, just mention the very highest kind of positive feeling one could have, which maybe is this deep, enduring sense of well-being, which she calls happiness. But she could well acknowledge there are other kinds of positive emotional experiences.
Mm.
Um, okay, you also mentioned the immortal robot. There's a passage in Leonard Peikoff's book. So Leonard Peikoff was Ayn Rand's student, for anyone who doesn't know, for many years, many decades, and he became the foremost spokesman of her philosophy. And he wrote this book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. And in that, there's a section on life as the essential root of value. And he talks about this. I think that's where he talks about the immortal robot, this thought experiment from Ayn Rand's article, The Objectivist Ethics, which is in that book, The Virtue of Selfishness, which I showed before. So here's what he says about the robot. Let's see. So I'll just read two or three paragraphs from this. The realm of existence is the fundamental, the metaphysical fundamental. It is that which every concrete and every issue presupposes. According to objectivism, this fact has a critical application to the field of values. The alternative of existence or non existence is the precondition of all values. If an entity were not confronted by this alternative, it could not pursue goals, not of any kind. So this alternative of existence or non-existence is what uniquely is faced by living organisms. Only living organisms can exist or not exist. Um, they can go out of existence, um, and they will unless they take certain actions. Like a rock could just, uh, which is not a living thing, will just sit there forever and nothing will happen to it. It won't decompose. So you could say the existence of the rock could be ended by like a glacier coming by and pulverizing it. But as long as nothing external acts on it, it doesn't have to do anything. It can just sit there and it'll exist forever. But a plant or an animal or a human being, it's not sufficient for it to just sit there and have nothing external act upon it. It has to do something to survive, to stay in existence, which the rock does not. So the plants and animal and human, they have to gain food, most obviously. And there are other things like clothing, shelter. Um, so just to continue a little more here. So there's this alternative of existence or non-existence. And then, so he says, if an entity were not confronted by this alternative, it cannot pursue goals, not of any kind. The simplest way to clarify this point is to concretize Ayn Rand's example of the immortal robot. Such a robot, not facing the alternative of life or death, requires no action to sustain itself. It is, quote, an entity which moves and acts, but which cannot be affected by anything, which cannot be damaged, injured, or destroyed, unquote. Imagine for a moment that this sort of entity were possible. What values could it act for? If the thing asked for suggestions, what goals could you recommend? Could you tell it to enjoy a good meal? Since the robot has no need of nutritive action, it has no mechanism of ingesting or digesting nutriment, no hunger pangs without food, no pleasure sensations from it. The subject of food and drink is outside its concern. What about advising it to go to the dentist so as to avoid the agony of a toothache? This robot does not have toothaches or any need of teeth, since it cannot be damaged. It need not concern itself with health or illness. To it, such concepts are inapplicable. Could you urge the thing to at least come in out of the rain? The elements have no effect on an indestructible entity. And I think I'll stop there. So, um, does it make sense for something like an immortal robot to pursue pleasure and avoid pain? So here he's saying, well, that doesn't really, it's not something it could do. It has no hunger pangs without food, it says, no pleasure sensations from it. So the way life actually operates is, I guess, evolutionarily, we evolved so that pleasure correlates with life and pain correlates with death. And if that weren't the case, if pleasure correlated with things that lead to our death and destruction, then we would pursue those things because that's what gives us pleasure. But then those things would be weeded out of the evolutionary pool. They would just kill themselves. Um, so I think it had to be the case that pleasure correlates with life. Those are the sorts of entities that survive because we have a reason to go after pleasure and avoid pain. So the things that promote pleasure are also the things that promote life. And this, you have to take a long run view of this. So like you could say, oh, well, eating ice cream gives me pleasure, but if I just eat ice cream all day, it could give me diabetes and a heart attack or something. But then if you consider the whole life and you consider the stomach ache you can have from the ice cream the next day and the pain that goes along with it, then you say, oh, okay, well, in a long run sense, yeah, pleasure still does correlate with life. If it's only if you take it out of context that it might seem that the pleasure doesn't correlate with life. I think you can make that kind of argument. And I think William James makes this argument. I don't know if he originated it, this idea that pleasure goes along with life, but it goes at least as far back as William James. Maybe that was the late 1800s. I don't know if Darwin had this idea. But anyways, I just wanted to read this passage from Leonard Peikoff's book because you had mentioned the immortal robots, and connected that to the issue of pleasure and pain somehow. Do you want to say any more about that? I don't know if
Yeah,
that passage addresses if you had a question or objection about that, but let me throw it back to you.
yeah. So I think that the point of Peikoff's experiment is to point out that um, values, like as a very broad category, all values, they in reality rely on a certain type of thing to exist, so living things. And so as it relates to the pleasure pain stuff, um, whenever I say, well, let's say a robot is immortal, does it have things to act for? Well, no. But what if I stipulate that it's that it has pleasure pain responses? It might be tempting to say that pleasure pain responses,
Hmm.
I might be demanding something like metaphysically impossible. Like maybe pleasure and pain are only features of living things. And so to speak of pleasure and pain as kind of something that's possessed by this immortal thing is impossible. Um, I mean, I don't really know if it is a contradiction. It might be. You might say that. But whenever I'm pursuing pleasure and pain, there might be some conditional thing that I have to propel myself towards. So maybe when I say that, I'm stipulating that it's living. But the big point though is that I think as it relates to forming an ethical system, so if we understand that enjoyment and positive experiences are the real goal of ethics, then whenever we bring up life as in reality being required for pleasure and pain, I think that it really just means we have to be objective about our experiences, right? And so it goes right back to what Rand said, that hedonism and that happiness isn't an undefined primary, it has real causal basis for it. And there's reasons you can discover that, actually will lead you towards happiness or against it. And so um, pleasure and pain or pleasure and joy might be the reasons we live, and it might be what we live for. But in order to do that, we have to be rational and we have to, in order to like conquer reality, you have to it's like in order to match reality, you have to like obey it or something like that. Like you have to, in order to pursue happiness, you have to obey by nature and then get it. So I think that's what Ayn Rand's really trying to say is that, or that Peikoff's trying to say is that there are no values in a vacuum. Values have a real factual causal basis, and that's living things.
Yeah. And this is reminding me of a point that I think might come up in that article by David Kelly that I mentioned before, that happiness has a content. There's not
Mm-hmm.
just happiness. When you're happy about something.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the term intentionality might be used in philosophy
Right.
to capture this something. You're not just conscious, you're conscious of something. So, um, if the hedonist view is that you're just pursuing happiness, that kind of abstracts away from the issue of what you're happy about. So, it, um, I guess if you really focus on that idea that there's a content to happiness, there is no just happiness, period. When you're happy about. Well, what is it that you're happy about? You're happy about how your life is going, maybe something like that. So that if that's the right kind of way to think about it, then that would really tie the notion of life closely to the notion of happiness. Life is provides content to happiness. I'm happy that I have a wife, or that I have these friends, or that I have this great career. Those things are what give meaning and content to your happiness. Um, so yeah, maybe that's how we need to, or how we make something like happiness objective,
Mhm.
is by filling it in with this sort of contents.
Yeah. And I've so I yeah, in that paper, Kelly said something that was or it might be the same. If you're talking about the choosing life essay, then that might be it. But there's another one. Kelly's written like a lot of stuff on that. He has this one paper and he uses the term ipso facto. And I think it's the one you're talking about, where if we think about consciousness as being intentional, so conscious of something, emotional states are also conscious states. And so what are emotions aware of? So you're aware of value. So whenever you're happy, you're happy about life, or you're experiencing the value of life, is kind of the idea. And so I think I would agree with this kind of intentional extensional language, that whenever we say life is the ultimate, or whenever we say, let's say enjoyment or positive experiences, whatever, if we say that's the ultimate value, it's enjoyment of life. That's the ultimate value, because factually speaking, enjoyment is enjoyment of living. That's the causal mechanism behind it. And so if you understand it that way, you might be able to say, well, life is the ultimate value if you understand life as the life of a conscious thing. So it's like a conscious life or something like that, like a life of enjoyment is the ultimate value. That's kind of
Mm.
where I'm at with that issue.
Yeah, a life of enjoyment. I kind of like that. I think I've thought about it similarly to that in the past as I've been grappling with this issue. Um, let's see. Oh, there's one other thought I wanted to put on the table, which is that going back to the immortal robot, uh, you were saying, well, maybe it's not metaphysically possible. I was thinking there, see, you might say, well, the robots can't have pleasure and pain because it's not conscious. Only living things could have pleasure and pain. Why? Well, only living things can be conscious. Like, and robots can't be conscious, contrary to what some people might think. Like, if you're in the field of artificial intelligence, I think that some people in that field might think that machines, computers can be conscious or they can think. And then there's some debate in that literature. Like, I think John Searle famously argues that computers aren't conscious. He's got his Chinese room thought experiments. For anyone who's taken a philosophy course, philosophy of mind, you might have come across John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment. But anyways, you might think that a a robot isn't the sort of thing that could have pleasure and pain because it's not conscious. First, it has to be alive, and then maybe it could be conscious. So plants are alive, but they don't have consciousness. So life is a necessary but not sufficient condition of consciousness. I think consciousness evolved for the purpose of serving life. So certain organisms, their consciousness is their means of survival. And Rand talks about this in the Objectivist Ethics. Like, for those organisms which possess consciousness, consciousness is a faculty of survival. So imagine how well a dog would survive if it didn't have its sense of smell or its eyes. You gouged out its eyes, it's going to have a much harder time surviving. It's got to be conscious of the world, see stuff to navigate the world and successfully deal with it. Plants, things that are stationary, they don't have to move around. They don't have a need of sensation because they don't locomote. So perception and locomotion go together. I think Aristotle might have been the first one to to make that tie,
Mhm.
and maybe it was his work De Anima on the soul. But it's the organisms that locomotes which have the faculty of perception, the five senses, and those senses help the organisms to survive. In the human case, you have a higher form. Not only do you have the five senses, but you have this conceptual faculty, the rational faculty. So Aristotle said that man was the rational animal. I don't know if you used exactly that phrase, but that's the phrase that's often associated with Aristotle's view or his definition of human beings. They're the rational animal. Now Ayn Rand, I think, understood better than Aristotle the life and death significance of reason. Aristotle had this view that humans, their highest good is to just contemplate, um, use their reason to understand the deep truths of the world, but they don't
Sure.
really have a practical significance. But Ayn Rand, living after the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, could see that the value of this really abstract knowledge, like Newton's laws, which apply to the entire universe, they're not just these abstract truths about how the world works. Rather, as Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power. So now we have all these
Sure.
amazing machines that can power our lives and create our modern technological civilization. So reason, our rational faculty, is an amazing tool of survival. It makes human beings, the Lord of the earth. I
Right.
don't know who said that, but anyways, consciousness, especially human consciousness, is a very powerful tool of survival. So there would be, so it's clear why a living thing would have a consciousness. It helps it survive. But what need would an inanimate thing like a computer have for consciousness? You might think it just doesn't make any sense if something is not alive, like a computer or some machine, that it would have consciousness. It would have no need for it. If you understand the value significance of consciousness, then you'll see that it makes more sense for just living things to have consciousness. Now, maybe you can just stipulate as a part of a hypothetical thought experiment. Well, what if a robot could have sensations of pleasure and pain, even though there would be no reason for it to? If we could somehow wire it to have those things, then what? Well, I
Hmm.
guess then it would make sense for it to pursue whatever gives it pleasure and
Yeah.
whatever helps it avoid pain. But then is it just, have we made it into a living organism by that
Right.
fact? um, I hadn't really thought of that before. Like maybe does that mean that like pleasure and pain is essential to something being a living organism? But no, that doesn't seem quite right, because I would say a plant is a living organism,
Right.
but they don't have pleasure and pain. So then the more fundamental is just, does something go after stuff?
Right.
Does it engage in goal-directed action? That's a phrase which I don't know if it's in Ayn Rand's work, but certainly in Harry Benswanger's book, or his PhD dissertation, The Biological Basis of Teleological Concepts. He talks a lot about goal-directed action. Um, so I think that's more fundamental than having pleasure and pain to being a living organism. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I've gone on for a long time.
No.
You want to jump in with anything?
Yeah. Yeah. On your what you were saying about consciousness, I actually emailed the ARI about this topic, about robots and whether or not you could say a robot is living. And so Ben Bayer responded to me, and he basically told me that in some way, right, it's possible that you can create a living thing out of these like kind of non-traditional materials. Um, but in order for something to qualify as living, it has to face the constant alternative of existence or non-existence. So he would like disqualify an iPad from that because, an iPad doesn't face a constant alternative of existence or non-existence. It's kind of selective. But he says that it's at least, possible to engineer living things out of those kind of materials.
Hmm. I wonder if he meant what sense of possibility he had in mind. Like, I mean, we
Metaphysical. I
can,
think it is metaphysical.
okay. And then there's a question of what exactly does that mean?
Hmm.
So he would say that the iPad is not living because it doesn't face a constant alternative of existence or non-existence.
Yeah.
But he also said that maybe something could be engineered that's not like carbon based, that's made out of some other sort of material
Hmm.
than actual living things are, that like a silicon based or something else, something
Yeah.
non-carbon based, there could be something like that that's living. um, and we can't rule that out. Um, but so I guess, so his point was just as long as the thing, whatever it's made of, faces a constant alternative of life or of existence or non-existence, then we could say it's living.
But that's a necessary condition. Yeah. That's something he ruled out. I mean, of course, there's like the whole self-generated action and self-directed and conditions like that. But yeah, a requirement is that it faces the constant alternative, is what he told me.
Hmm. Yeah, that seems right to me, thinking off the top of my head about it. but yeah, like you said, there would be other conditions. So Ayn Rand, she defines life as a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action.
Mm.
And or at least that's a characterization she gives. I don't know if that's strictly a definition.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess self-generated, self-sustaining and self-generated. So it has to have some kind of internal source of energy to be self-sustaining. And so plants would have that, right? They've got their system, their chemical system. Uh, they say they take in energy from the outside, the sunlight, and somehow they convert that into um, energy that keeps them in existence. And so if some other kind of being existed that did that, maybe through some other mechanism other than cellular metabolism, siliconal metabolism or whatever, as long as it's keeping itself in existence and it's doing that in a self-generated kind of way. It's not just powered by batteries external to it. It's got some kind of mechanism inside of itself.
Mm.
Then yeah, I don't see why not call that a living thing.
I mean, and there's another example I guess I came up with. Imagine like a solar powered Roomba, like like the floor vacuum.
Yeah.
Like it seems to me like I can't really disqualify that as living. Um, it seems maybe the reason why we think it isn't is because maybe the Roomba could die and then it gets brought back to life, right? And so we might say, well, the Roomba could die and come back to life. Is it really living? But I mean, we do that with humans, right? So I mean, I don't really, I have this friend and he has this view that robots are this primitive kind of life, which I mean, I'm at least sympathetic towards because I really can't rule out uh,
Hmm.
these kinds of thought experiments on the basis of their material composition. It really has to be about, are they self-generating? Are they pursuing goals? They face an alternative of existence. And even our ordinary language kind of tracks on to treating robots like they're living, right? Oh, my phone died. Oh, my Roomba's going to clean my
Huh.
room. It's like we already animate them in our language. I mean, so maybe it's a fiction or maybe it is really like they do fall into the category of living in some primitive way.
Okay. I'm reluctant to go along with that, but let me see if I can articulate why and make it more than a feeling. Um, so we do use terms often, like my phone died, but I think these are just metaphorical senses. It's very convenient to use these terms, so and I think that's why we do it. But I think in a literal sense, we don't mean them. Uh, but to tie it more to the points that Rand discusses, like so I think with the Roomba, its existence is not contingent on it performing actions like cleaning a room. So if it didn't do that, it wouldn't go out of existence. It would just sit there and collect dust, I guess, but it wouldn't disintegrate, decompose. So I would point to that as a key difference between it and an actual living thing.
Mm,
It doesn't have to do anything to stay in existence. It just has to not have anything done to it. Like it has to be not stepped on or crushed by a boulder or something. So, what do you think about that? Does that suffice to differentiate it from a living thing?
So some of my pushback is this, and this is something I had thought about before, is life. So Ayn Rand has this whole kind of I don't know if it's like in her fiction or in her nonfiction, but she has this big kind of conclusion leading up to the idea that life is motion, that life is self-propelled, self-sustained motion, and that death is stillness. That's what distinguishes it. Um, like a living thing, you could say that, the entity continues to exist, like the material, right? But the motion stops. Um, my holdup here then is like, well, the death isn't really about decomposition. It's really about the ceasing of self-motion, self-generated action, to continue self-generated action. And if you understand it like that, well, then the Roomba kind of does face that alternative of, well, its energy is depleting and it can't continue to sweep the floor if or you clean the floor if its energy depletes, so it needs to charge. And maybe the Roomba isn't the greatest example, but at least understanding like some experiment where you know there's a robot and it has an energy source and it's acting to keep gaining energy or something. Um, it seems like that's a kind of life, at least under the conditions that Rand laid out, because it's self motion and the self motion is conditional and it acts to gain or keep the self motion.
Okay. The well, one thought I had on that, the idea that life is motion, if you interpret that to include internal motion, then maybe that will suffice to distinguish a Roomba from like plants and animals.
Mhm.
So so imagine there's no internal motion in the Roomba. Um, there doesn't, it will still exist. Like it doesn't have to circulate blood. It doesn't have to metabolize nutrients. Doesn't have to take in sunlight, process water through roots. It doesn't have to do any of those things on the inside. So if we're looking at it from the point of view of life is motion, and we're saying, well, the Roomba isn't moving and the plant isn't moving. Well, actually, one is moving. The plant is moving. If you look at it on the inside and you consider what's
Mhm.
going on inside of it. So maybe that's a way to say that the Roomba is not alive. It doesn't have a motion even on the inside,
Mhm.
whereas the plant does.
Yeah. I guess I guess a thought experiment that might kind of equalize that. If let's say I have like a stretch of land and I have some like solar powered robot, and the solar powered robot exists on this stretch of land, and from whatever distance it is, whatever is, let's say a mile or something. For every mile on this road, there's like a charging station. Okay, and it would get charged if it moved to that thing. Um, Now, if the robot were to consume energy, take the energy, and then propel itself towards the charging station to refuel on energy, to then go to more charging stations, um, it would seem as if that's living. And you could compare it to a plant. I don't really know how that wouldn't be the same as a plant, because in some way you could say that the robot has internal motion because it takes in charge that it gained by its action and then uses that charge to go and get more charge. So it's like self-propelling for continuing motion.
Okay. Now imagine it doesn't go through this process of taking in energy from the sun and going to the next charging station. It just sits in one place the whole time. Uh, does it go out of existence or decompose?
Um, I mean, is the energy being used to do something? Because I might say if the energy just like exists in the battery and it depletes, then I couldn't say it's living because it's not self-propelling to self-propel. But if it's just dying, I don't, or not dying, but in a literal sense. But if the energy is just getting depleted and it's not being used to self-propel, I couldn't really say it's living because it's not self-sustaining.
It seems to me that what's missing here is that it doesn't make a difference to the the robot's existence, whether it stays in one place or goes from one charging station to the next. It's going to exist the same either way. I mean, it will be in different places if it goes around to different charging stations, but um, it doesn't make a difference to existence full stop. Like
Huh.
it's still going to exist whether it's just stays in one spot or goes to these other places. So it doesn't seem like it makes a difference to the existence of the robot in a way that it does make a difference to the existence of the plants
Right.
if it does the kinds of motions, internal motions, cellular metabolism, um, circulation of whatever that fluid is inside of plants, forget what it's called. If it doesn't do those things, it's not going to still exist. It's going to break down and decompose.
Mm.
So it seems to me
Yeah.
that that would distinguish between them.
Well, for me, it's like, again, it's like what when we say the plant goes out of existence, like the material doesn't, it's the motion that's stopping. Um, and so I mean, it's a little vague to me. Like the the robot actually given some amount of time will decompose. Maybe not immediately. But if we understand, its existence leaving as in the physical components, well, that happens over a long time. But whenever I say something's dying, I'm I don't think I'm primarily fundamentally saying this physical thing stops existing. I'm saying this physical thing living stops. Like the bot, like all the parts are still there. There's no life anymore. There's no motion.
Yeah, so it's the process of self-sustaining, self-generated action that
That
stops.
stops.
Yeah. And Rand has this line in the Objectivist Ethics. She says, or maybe it's from Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged, which is quoted in the Objectivist Ethics. When a living thing dies, its chemical elements remain, but its life goes out of existence. And so if we understand life to be a process of self-sustaining, self-generated action, then that's the thing that goes out of existence, though the chemical elements remain. So is the but then is there a process of self-sustaining? There is a process of self-sustaining, self-generated action in the plants, but is there that in the robots? Is there a process of self-sustaining, self-generated action? I don't see that there is. So I think you're right that it will go out of existence in a longer time scale. Like things can be weathered away. Like erosion takes place on a time scale of millions of years. And, if you go back in geological time, what used to be a mountain might just vanish, right?
Right.
Because it will be eroded away. Uh, but that's in that sort of going out of existence, what's what's causing it to go out of existence is that there are, we might call them external factors which are impinging on the mountain. There's wind, there's rain, and those things over time will cause it to go out of existence. But what causes the plant to go out of existence, it might also be wind and rain if they're too much of it. Uh, but also, if there isn't too much wind and rain, maybe it's nice weather. But if it stops performing these internal processes, that also suffices to make it go out of existence. So I think that's the difference. It's like those there's a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action, which is keeping it in existence, which is not what's keeping the mountain or the robot in existence.
Mm.
Rather, it's the
Um,
lack of some external thing, some external damaging force that's keeping it in existence.
yeah. Um, yeah, when I understand the internal motion stuff, I know that Ben Zwinger in his dissertation you were talking about the biological basis of teleological concepts. He has this thing about like self motion and self direction. And I guess the way that I think about that is if you take some action of a thing, understand that as kind of production and consumption. So something is like self-generating and self-sustaining if the action is both productive and consumptive towards the same thing. So like if I have the action of, if I have this game, if I have the robot and the robot gains power to go out and seek more power to gain more power. Hold on. Then that kind of thing is sorry, hold on. I'm doing something. Yeah, sorry. That kind of thing is producing and consuming the motion for the motion. It's producing the motion and it's consuming the motion to produce more, or using it to produce more. So I still think the Roomba, or not the Roomba, but the robot on the road and the power stations, I still think that would have an internal mechanism, because if the internal mechanism faults, it also stops moving. So it's not just the absence of external factors, it's also that it has to go out and propel its motion by like independently too.
Um, okay. So, but what is it like if it doesn't propel itself around? Well, first of all, let me just make the point that I think you were getting at, and just put it in different terms. So, life is the goal of life. I
Hmm.
think that's a formulation or something like it in
Hmm.
Harry Binswanger's book. So, life is a cyclical process. It's not for something beyond itself. It's not for something other than life. Um, so, by living, we are able to continue living.
Right.
Um, I don't know if eating here would be a good example. Like I I live in order to, or I eat in order to live, and I live in order to eat. I mean, if you take the pleasure of food to be one of the things that makes
Right.
life
Right.
worth living, then maybe you could look at it from that sort of as a cycle in that way. I eat to live, or I eat to have sex, or sorry, I live to eat, I live to have sex, I live to be with my friends,
Right.
and these experiences also give us fuel to live further. So
Hmm.
being with friends, or having pleasurable sex, having pleasurable food allows us to continue living. So there's so anyways, life is the goal of life. That's a formulation I wanted to get out there. But now to go back to the Roomba. Um, so you were saying it's it engages in this cyclical kind of process as well. That was the
Hmm.
idea.
Yeah.
Um, so it has to, let's say, charge in order to move around.
To continue to charge.
Okay. But
So there's energy production and consumption towards continuing to move.
yeah. But then I still come back to this question of, well, what difference does it make to its existence, whether it moves around or not? I don't see that it does make a difference. And that's where I would see the distinction between it and a living thing.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it goes back to what is the when we say life is the difference maker, it's like, is life if life is the process, then it makes a difference to the process of the Roomba. The Roomba's life, the Roomba's motion will go out of existence. The Roomba, like the material, will stay there, but the life of the Roomba will be gone.
Well, does it really have a life though? Because if life is a process of self-sustaining, self-generated action, I'm not sure it's got a life because it's engaged in action, but is it self-sustaining action?
Yeah, that's gets
I
into
don't.
another thing. Like, it self-sustaining. Like, kind of depends what you mean by self there. Because if by self you mean the motion, then of course not. Um, but then it gets a little vague. Like, what exactly is the self of a plant versus the self of a Roomba? Like, if the Roomba loses some parts, they'll lose itself, type kind of thing.
Okay,
Like, what is the
so
life of a plant really?
okay, well, if maybe the life of the plant is the set of processes it goes through to
Hmm.
sustain itself, and I guess maybe the Roomba only has the first half of that. It has a set of processes when it moves around, but they're not processes that sustain itself. They're just processes.
Right. Well, when we say
Because
sustains
if it didn't
itself,
have, it's because it, just one second, because if it didn't engage in those processes, it would still exist. Whereas if the plant didn't engage in its processes, it would not exist.
right. Um, well, whenever we say like it has processes, but are they like self-sustaining? When we say like the self there, are we talking about the object's existence? Or are we talking about the object's existence as mo like moving, right? So again, like the plant as an object continues to exist, just not a it's not a self-propelling object. Um, so I mean,
Mm.
in some way, it is self-sustaining. If you mean self as in like the existence of it as moving, as self-moving towards the processes.
So what exactly is, so you raised the distinction between self as an object and
Self as an
self
object in
as
action.
self as an object and action.
In action, yeah.
Oh, in
In
action,
action, yeah. So
an
it's like
object in action.
the processes, are they sustaining the existence of the thing as an object, or is it sustaining the existence of the object going through the processes?
Mm. We're getting into some subtle things, tricky territory here.
Yeah,
Um, just one other type of motion that occurred to me that happens in a inanimate thing is the motion of the molecules. Like you've got
right.
electrons moving around or um, a nucleus. Um, so you might think there are actions, but in processes of a sort, but what kind of, so I guess there's some kind of distinction between those sorts of processes and the kind of processes in a plant. But also there's, if we want to get even maybe deeper is the word, like what is an object? Like set aside whether it's living or not, um like where does the rock stop? Like if you look at the edges,
Right.
it's kind of blurry,
Yeah,
right? Kind of you might take Thales's view, like the world is a
yeah.
plenum. There's just a continuity, and um,
Yeah, that is something that objectivism that was one of the things that I'd consider bringing up is objectivism is kind of does not have a theory of ontology. So, there are all these views about, are there really distinctions between things? Is reality continuous? Is it discrete? Um, uh, yeah, so stuff like that. And objectivism doesn't have an ontological view. Now, Ayn Rand has stuff on like, well, an entity is the bedrock of reality. An entity is its attributes. Just that. But I mean, she doesn't really have there's not a lot of case examples she uses to kind of explain that in day-to-day life.
some of this might be discussed in the appendix to Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology.
Hmm.
I'm not sure. I think there's a section in there about entities,
Yeah.
but I don't know if I think the view that Thales had, I think Dr. Peikoff might sign on to that somewhere. The idea that reality is a plenum. There is no nothing. So, contrary to
Right.
Parmenides, or no, not contrary, in agreement with Parmenides, what is, and what is not is not. So there is
Hmm.
no nothing. Um, so I guess maybe an implication of that is that the universe is a plenum, solidly packed. There's no little pockets of nothing. But
Yeah.
see if we can get a little back, a little closer back to the what we were talking about uh and trying to distinguish the Roomba from living things. So you were saying, okay, so you had this idea of, or you were distinguishing between an object, period, and then an object in action.
Hmm.
And I think you were raising the question, what exactly do we mean um, when we're talking about self-sustaining, self-generated action? Are we talking by self there, do we mean some objects or some object in action? Uh,
See, this
I
is
guess,
interesting because you had a discussion with my friend Synth one time on your channel.
oh yeah.
And you guys talked about the self. And this is kind of the same thing. Like uh this gets into questions about his, what's called aseity, which is like what makes something this particular thing and what accounts for its existence over time. It's I think the word is diachronic identity, like what makes it the same over multiple instances. And the same kind of, I guess, challenge is applied to plants. And the whole plenum stuff is interesting because it seems to imply that, well, not seems to, or it even implies, but you can interpret that to mean that there are no real differences at the bare level of reality. Um, but that's a whole nother thing. But it's similar. It's similar to that kind of challenge.
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember exactly how it came up in that discussion, but hold on a second. Let me just turn a light on.
Very good.
Okay. Uh, oh, yeah, the last thing I said made me think of well, what do we mean by action? If we're going to say s- uh, so if we're wondering about this phrase object in action, what do we mean by action there? So does a rock or a Roomba, does it act
Hmm.
or does it just react? We we might want to explore that a bit because if the I think in a sense only living things act and inanimate things only react.
Yeah.
But to spell out exactly what that sense is might take some work.
Well,
But
my pushback to that would be
yeah.
whenever you say only things only react, well, do inanimate things react to the reactions of other things, or do they react to the actions of inanimate things? Do you see what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Like,
Yeah, so I think maybe what's coming to mind is this idea of an internal source of energy, which
mhm,
Harry Benswanger brings up as I think one of the characteristics of life. It has to have an internal store of energy, and maybe that can be used to flesh out this idea of what or this distinction between action and reaction. Like if something has an internal store of energy, like a plant takes in sunlight and then it somehow stores that in sugars in its internal workings, and then it can release that internally stored energy to make its leaves turn a certain way, then we can say it's acting. But if something doesn't have internal storage of energy, then maybe it's only reacting. But then you might say,
mhm.
okay, well, we can put batteries in a Roomba, and
Right,
are they
right, right, right.
storing energy inside the Roomba, and therefore does it have an internal store of energy? Um, well, yeah, in a way. But then maybe we
Hmm.
could ask, well, how did it get there? How did the batteries get there? Um, is it because if they got there by some human stuck them inside it, well, that's a very different way than the plants got to have its internal store of energy. So maybe we would have to tell some story about how the internal source of energy was established and use
Right.
that as a basis for distinguishing between living and or between action and inaction
And
or
I
action
actually,
and reaction.
when I emailed Ben Bayer, so part of it was me asking about could artificial, meaning like, man-made or purposefully created, because those things be living. And he actually said something really smart. In a way, we are all artificially living because we were, created, assuming you weren't like an accident or something, but like you were a creation of your parents or something, right? Like they created you. Um, and so that kind of is a thing. It's like, well, you can't dismiss something being living on the grounds that it was created, because that'd dismiss everything that's living.
Yeah, we are artificial creations in a way. If you're a parent, you can, well, I mean, you can decide to be a parent. So is that a artificial creation? So I guess this term artificial is often distinguished from natural.
Right.
Uh, so would we say like the plant has the source of its internal source of energy is natural, whereas the Roomba's source of internal energy is artificial. But if we're going to say that having a child, human beings having deciding to have a child is artificial, then we can't really use that to distinguish between the Roomba and the plants. Uh, anyways, I don't know if you want to stay on this for longer or if you want to go to anything else. Did you want to keep exploring this topic? Or do you feel like there's something unresolved here? Like it's still unclear why we should say the Roomba is not living?
No, I think it's fine. It's not like the most important like point really. I mean, nothing philosophically turns on the Roomba living or yeah. But if you want, if you're still down, we can talk about free will if you want to move to that. It
Okay.
might be
Well,
late if, but
a couple things. So one is it might be better to save that for a separate conversation, the free will
sure.
stuff, because it is getting kind of late and we've gone on for a while. Um, and then also, I think it is, or it might be important to be able to say that the Roomba is not living. Because I think, or at least like, I feel like there's, if we're just left in a position of saying, well, it's not clear whether it's living or not, that feels kind of unsatisfying to me. Like to me, it's obviously not living, and um, I guess it can be a challenge in some of these cases to explain exactly why. And maybe having talked about it for a while, uh, it's at least some of the reasons for saying it's not living are have been discussed. So for people listening to this, I at least want hope that they have a fuller sense of why, from Ayn Rand's perspective, one would not want to say or might not want to say that something like a Roomba is living. So we've talked about these various features like having self-sustaining or self-generated action, having an internal source of energy,
Hmm.
how these sorts of things, or these sorts of characteristics can help to distinguish between living and non-living things. But maybe we still have to do some more analysis to make it totally clear on this particular example, um, as to why you might think a Roomba is living or not. And maybe for this conversation, we'll just have to leave it up in the air, leave people hanging. Um,
Yeah,
but I hope people at least have a better feel for the view of what sorts of considerations are relevant, even
right.
if we haven't totally brought to bear those considerations in a finalizing, resolving way for this particular example. At least the sorts of considerations that are relevant, I think, I hope those have become more clear to people, and then they can take those considerations and apply them to various examples and think about it more. And maybe they can help us resolve this. You can add a
Right.
comment, you leave a comment below this video, subscribe and like, uh,
Yeah.
all that stuff. So, okay. So I guess this is a good place. Do you have any last thoughts on this or anything else you want to say before we wrap this one up?
Yeah. Well, it's actually interesting. So I did kind of think about it more after I said it. I guess there are kind of implications of this into like maybe applied ethical issues. So if we understand artificial really as being, is your life dependent on the actions of another thing, right? That might have relevant implications for the issue of abortion and discussing parasitism and whether parasitism really makes something living or not. But that's kind of a wide thing. It just kind of depends on how you maybe define that condition. But no, I think that was good.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was good too. Sometimes these don't always these conversations don't always have like a neat resolution, and a lot of times, they just leave questions hanging. But I think just talking about it for a while, it kind of crystallizes certain issues, so there can still be a progress of a kind. Um, and people who are not familiar at all with Ayn Rand have a much better
Much better
uh,
understanding. Yeah.
idea of her view if they hear this. Okay. Oh, just one thought on the parasitism. So I think something can definitely be living if it is a parasite, but then the question with an issue like abortion is, can something have rights
Right.
if it's living as a parasite? But that's another big discussion, which I guess is best saved for another time. I have one or two debates about abortion on my channel, so if people want to check those out. You can just search for that topic on my channel. All right, Liam. Well, thanks for coming on and doing this. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, it was super enjoyable. I hope to do this again.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool.
Talk to you later.
Peace.